Tawada, thank you for doing the recording button. It is my pleasure to introduce Salvatore Attardo. Before I do that, I want to say thank you to the organizers for the amazing effort that pulled in such a short amount of time. And thank you for everybody for being patient. Every session I've been in has been wonderful, and people have been supportive and tolerant of any technical hiccups, and there have not been many. I'm here to introduce Sal Attardo. He's professor of linguistics at Texas A&M University Commerce. He's also there the director of the Masters in Applied Linguistics and the Applied Linguistics concentration in the PhD program. When I think of Sal Attardo, the first thing that comes to mind is humor. Indeed, he's probably the world's expert on humor. He has published extensively and widely on this. Indeed, he's the most prolific scholar. I think I've counted 15 books, more than 100 articles. On humor, he's published books such as Linguistic Theories of Humor, and that's from 1994. But he keeps adapting and expanding the field, now focusing on the impact of the internet on humor. And if you're interested in that connection, you should know that his book, Humor 2.2, How the Internet Changed Humor, is coming out in paperback very soon. And he has contributed to this field not only with, as I said, original and seminal work, but with community building work. Outstanding service like editing the International Journal of Humor Research for, I think, 10 years, and publishing the Encyclopedia of Humor Studies, the Handbook of Language and Humor. But Sal is more than a funny guy and a guy who talks about and writes about funny things. He has also contributed more generally to various topics in semantic and pragmatics, multimodality and eye tracking. He has a textbook, Eye Tracking in Linguistics, and he's the co-author of a textbook in linguistics in its 4th edition now. And he has recently published Pragmatics and its applications to TESOL and SLA. So I think this gives you a sense of what a broad scholar he is and the kind of commitment that he has to bringing his expertise to the community and working towards building that community. So Sal, the floor is yours. We look forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you, Maite. That's a very lovely introduction, and I will adopt not just a funny guy as my motto from now on. I love that. I would like to echo Maite's words about thanking the organizers for pulling off going from an in-person conference to an online conference over just a few days. I've organized online conferences. I know how much work that involves. So hats off to you. You know, that really is an impressive feat. And I just wish, you know, we didn't have to do this under these tragic circumstances. I've seen the news. I think everybody we have. So it's really sad. So let me share my screen. I have, so you should be seeing my slides, yes? Very good. Today I'm going to talk about humor as eristic discourse in the age of the internet. So it's kind of bringing together several strands. So the outline is I'm going to first talk about the dark side of humor. Then I'm going to talk about eristic discourse, and then I'm going to bring the two things together and argue that it's an interesting point from a pragmatic standpoint. So first of all, humor has a positive image. I think nobody will be surprised by this. You know, some of the biggest work, the most important work in psychology for example, is done within the framework of positive psychology. That's already telling you something, right? Also, here you have an image of a clown entertaining children in a hospital. There is humor has been described as a healing process, both literally and figuratively. That is, there are studies that purport to show that enjoying humor actually helps you heal. Humor is widely seen as a progressive force. That's more or less the point of Young's book that's there in the image. And I'm going to talk more about it. But this idea that somehow progressive, humor, satire is a tool of progress. Now, however, there's a dark side to humor. And of late, there has been a growing interest in this side. And of course, I mean, we've always known that there's an aggression theory of humor, of course, and of course, there's nasty, racist, sexist humor. We've known about this. But there are two novel aspects of this, which can be traced back to less than a decade. The first one is the use of the alt-right of humor to proselytize. Okay, that is a relative novelty. And this is part of a broader process of normalization of far-right discourse that Ruth Wodak has talked about. So it kind of fits into this broader view. And the other aspect is this use of humor as eristic argumentation. I'm going to talk, if you're not familiar with the term eristic, don't worry, I'll define it. So no fear. So the use of humor by the alt-right to recruit. I made this slide to illustrate sort of visually this radicalization thesis that Sienkiewicz and Marx in a very recent, a very good book they present. And their point is that the strategy that the alt-right is using is to start from what is essentially general audience media. But the Babylon Bee, you may have heard of it. Gutfeld is one of the most successful late night shows. But also comedians like Dennis Miller, Tim Allen, Jay Leno, Joe Rogan's podcast, right? So these are mainstream, right-wing leaning, but mainstream acts. So they then make reference to or link to or are connected with or have as their host people who are more in the niche domain, right? So we're starting to move towards extreme views. Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, podcasts like Legion of Skanks. These are just examples. Sienkiewicz and Marx have much more. This then leads to things like trolling, shitposting on 4chan, and really sort of extreme content that's openly racist, homophobic, etc., etc. And finally, at the extreme end of this process, you have open Nazi propaganda, which is easily found on the internet, extremely homophobic, misogynistic, racist humor, up to the point of turning, terrorist attacks like the Christchurch shooter into memes, okay? And if you don't believe me, here's a few examples, and I apologize in advance. I picked examples that were not as disgusting as I could have picked far worse, okay? But this is a general audience. So on the left, you have a web page which, as a joke, maintains that Hitler was misunderstood and the Holocaust was just a misunderstanding. Very funny. I'm joking, please understand. This here at the top is the meme out of Brenton is the Christchurch shooter, right? And so that's the idea that he's been imitated by others, and therefore he's become iconic. At the bottom, you have Pepe the Frog. This is a character that was co-opted by the alt-right as a clan member, as an SS soldier, and standing outside the Auschwitz. And there you have a meme tweeted by Donald Trump himself, in which he represents himself as Pepe. Okay, so as you can see, this has colonized the whole alt-right environment. Now, Sienkiewicz and Marx present their thesis very well. It's a very well-written book. I recommend it. But they don't really talk about the evidence for it. They just present the thesis. So that bothered me. So I went and did some research, because that's what you do, right? And I found out that, as a matter of fact, there is plenty of evidence to support this thesis. So first of all, there's qualitative research. And so, for example, Mann, totally agrees with that idea. And he talks of 3 stages: normalization, remember Bodak, acclimation, and then dehumanization, when you are fully into, And interestingly enough, he says irony and humor play key roles. Memes, often under the guise of edgy humor, form a key medium for normalization, right? In other words, you start joking about anti-Semitism, and the next thing you know, you're doing real anti-Semitism, misogynism, etc. Irony provides plausible deniability. We're going to talk about this more, because the plausible deniability is the fig leaf that the alt-right uses. And there's many others. I've listed a few there. But this is qualitative, right? What about quantitative? Oh, there's plenty of evidence quantitatively as well. Okay, Horta Ribeiro and Mamiya have done studies that very clearly show, if you analyze the traffic between mainstream right and then up, down, all the way to alt-right, basically it shows that half of the users that watch mainstream right-wing content end up in the alt-right domains as well. Okay, so it really is happening. It's not just, oh well, this is an idea. This is something that is happening. And the Mamiya study is particularly interesting because it documents the fact of anti-feminist websites also ending there. So that's where you have the men's right galaxy, the incels, and so on. It always ends up into this big alt-right cauldron. So what causes this? I mean, what's the explanation? Why does this happen? Well, there's many explanations that people have proposed. One of which is that it's just the affordance of the media. I mean, we know that Facebook, for example, feed is determined by engagement. And of course, polarizing, divisive posts achieve high engagement. Humor also achieves high engagement. So you would sort of put things together, right? So that makes a certain amount of sense. And some people have argued, for example, Munger and Phillips, that it was always there. The only thing that Facebook and YouTube and whatever have done is make it visible, so that now we can see that it's there, but it was always there. People are just nasty, and that's the way it is and always been. Some more sophisticated explanation use network theory. The idea is that weak ties favor the spread in social media, and that's a reasonable explanation. Psychologists have looked at this idea of online disinhibition, which is very plausible as well. That is, if you are posting something online, it's very different than saying somebody face-to-face something else, right? You don't have to deal with their facial expression or the potential that they'll hit you on the head, right? So it's a very different thing to post and anonymously most of the time, right? On 4chan, for example, it's all anonymous, right? So no one knows that you posted that. So there is this idea of dissociative anonymity, which is, again, as I said, plausible, and certainly accounts for this. But there are other explanations as well. The radicalization thesis that we discussed, but there's also a much more simplistic but quite effective explanation, which is that there are people who are pouring enormous amounts of money into this galaxy of right-wing media. And so, you have the Koch brothers, Thiel, Elon Musk, and so on and so forth. These have been well documented. And, well, of late, Putin. The Russians have been putting real money into this as well. Here, I would like to add my own personal little contribution. It's more of a hunch than a hypothesis at this point. I don't even know exactly how you would try to prove this. But I think that the use of mockery and humor, aggressive humor, is essentially a filler to compensate for the fact that they don't have any rational argument to put forward. If you look at what the alt-right post, outrage is, of course, very common thing. Oh, look what outrageous thing these people on the left have done. But also, it's largely complaining about being victimized. Okay, now that's surprising, right? Because they're trying to project this Übermensch image, but they're complaining quite a lot. Okay, and of course you have the palingenetic content of all fascist movement have this idea that there was an ideal society that somehow we need to go back to. Okay, and so I think that mockery, using aggressive humor, allows you to recoup a modicum of agency and a feeling of superiority. If you mock somebody, you feel superior to them, even though you just spent 15 minutes complaining how they're victimizing. So I think that might be a part of the story. So why humor as part of the strategy of the alt-right? Well, as I said, as I hinted before, you get this just kidding defense, okay? That is, the idea is that humor offers plausible deniability. The idea, I didn't mean it, I was just kidding, and so, for example, that's what Alex Jones has said, when he was indicted for his comments about the Sandy Hook massacre. He said, well, it was a performance. I didn't mean it. Okay, that didn't work. He was condemned anyway. Now, respectable scholars, including yours truly, have said that this is the case, okay, that humor allows you to decommit from what you say. And that's true, except that it's true only for a single instance, okay? So, for example, let's say that now, I don't know why, but I made a joke about Australians, okay? So I make a funny joke about Australians, right? So people would say, oh, okay, well, Sal made a joke about Australians. But I have not been known to ever mock the Australians before, and I never mock the Australians again. Maybe my joke was in bad taste or whatever, but people wouldn't really hold it against me because it was one joke. But if I started every single one of my presentations with making fun of Australians, after a while, people would say, well, he really doesn't like Australians. He's got a chip on his shoulder against Australians. What did they do to him? Was he attacked by a kangaroo or something? I don't know, right? So, and this is the idea of enregisterment. And essentially, a simplified version of enregisterment is if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Okay, that is, if you keep doing something, if you make anti-Semitic jokes every day, you are an anti-Semite, period. Okay, that is, you can no longer appeal to the plausible deniability of humor, because it's the repetition that makes it, then stick, essentially. All right, so eristic discourse. So who is Eris? Eris is the goddess of discord, okay? And you can see her here in the background. She has just thrown a golden apple on the table, okay? And, this is a wedding that she wasn't invited to because people don't want the goddess of discord to a wedding, right? She took it badly. This is the myth, right? And so she throws this apple that's destined to the prettiest of Venus, who is depicted naked. Well, she's the goddess of love. What did you expect? Juno, who is the one wearing the veil here, and Minerva, the goddess of war, wearing the armor. Needless to say, Paris, who has to decide who gets the apple, gets in trouble. And long story short, the Trojan War comes from this, right? So this is who Eris is, okay? And now if you go back for a second to the original picture, actually you can see the apple flying here. So that's a very literal depiction of the myth, okay? So what is eristic argumentation? Actually, this goes back all the way back to Plato, okay? And Plato basically says it's an illegitimate form of disputation that the sophists used. And absolutely importantly, they use it to make money. Okay, that is, Plato's argument is the sophists are fakes because they don't mean it. They're just in it for the money. Okay, so they're not trying to get to truth or to reality or an understanding of the situation, whatever. And so Benjamin, who has written a very good article about the early eristic philosopher, the rhetoricians, says that the participants violate the serious purpose of the dispute. And Aristotle follows Plato completely. He basically says there is, quote unquote, good reasoning that produces knowledge, and then there is a eristic argument with that doesn't produce knowledge. It's just trying to win the argument. So let's do a jump of a couple of thousand years, and let's get to Ruth Wodak, who I'm sure would be enormously amused that I've put her in the same sentence with Plato and Aristotle. She analyzed in 2017 the eristic style of argument of a populist Austrian politician who was debating a candidate from the Green Party. And this list is called from her article on things that make this argumentation eristic. So the populist repeated the question 8 times, which is astonishing, attacked and provoked the interlocutor, interrupted 10 times more frequently, didn't reply to questions, and used a bunch of ad hominem fallacious argument accusing the Green candidate of being part of the system, of being a liar, of having been a communist, of being pedantic, of never having really worked in business, etc., etc., etc. I cut the slide. Okay, it is a remarkable thing. So this article by Wodak is what sort of got me started thinking about the use of aggressive discourse, eristic discourse in general, not just in political debates, but in general. So now we're going to switch slightly the pace, and let's start looking at this from a pragmatic standpoint, right? After all, this is a pragmatics conference, right? So clearly, if you look at Grice's principle of cooperation, eristic discourse is non-cooperative. I don't think I need to, particularly emphasize this fact, right? It involves violating the maxims of relevance, of quality, of manner, sort of without any redeeming quality. So these are no flouts. We're not trying to imply something. We're just not following the rules. Now, an interesting twist is that you don't have to actually violate every single rule, every single sentence, right? There is every utterance doesn't have to be violated. You can pick and choose what you violate, right? So you can say, I'm happy to be here, and then the next thing out of your mouth is false, and then you say something true, and then the next thing is false, etc. Right? You can sort of pick and choose what you violate, and that makes it harder to detect what is true and what is cooperative and what isn't. Okay, and makes it harder to respond. So moving on, Habermas. Now, he doesn't get quoted very much in pragmatics, but he's got something very interesting to say in this context. He has this idea of formal pragmatics, which is not what you and I would think of as pragmatics, but basically he says these are universal validity claims that the participants in an interaction assume. And these claims can be asked for, can be redeemed anytime, right? So I can ask you, what do you mean by this? And you're supposed to be able to explain it, and that's what makes your claim valid in one way. There's 4 factors, there are 4 of these validity claims. So the first one is that you should be understandable, not particularly relevant here. You should communicate, you should have the intention of communicating a true proposition, right? That's becoming quite significant. You should express your intentions truthfully so that the hearer can believe the utterance. And finally, you must choose the utterance that's right so that the hearer can accept the utterance. Okay, so this is a pretty lofty goal, and he's been criticized for being too idealistic and this not being realistic, as Grice has been criticized. But I think that they're onto something. And in fact, Habermas says, yeah, you have to agree to these things if things go well. But if there is a failure at any of these levels, then it may result in, and this is a quote from Habermas, incomprehension, misunderstanding, intentional and involuntary untruthfulness, concealed and open discord. My emphasis, by the way. Okay, so Habermas is saying, if you don't follow these rules, what's going to happen is maybe discord. Okay, so you see where I'm going with that. Well, politeness. I'm not going to try and define politeness at the pragmatics conference. I'm not that stupid. I picked Watt's model because it's got a nice picture. And so I was like, all right, this is good. I can work with the picture. And you can see where I've put eristic discourse. It clearly falls somewhere between impolite and rude. Okay? It's clearly not appropriate behavior. It's not politic behavior. It's not appropriate. It's negatively marked. It's something that's frowned upon. Davidson has a principle of charity. Now, it gets very complicated, and there are many definitions, some very complex, but some of the less technical ones are actually reasonably easy to grasp. So, maximize agreement, or disagreement is only possible against a large background of agreement. Now, this seems strange, but think about it. If I say, no, the plenary was supposed to start at 4:15. You say, no, it was supposed to start at 4:30. We agree that there was a plenary, that it was supposed to start at a certain time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing that we disagree on is, well, the exact time that it was supposed to start, right? So we have to share an enormous amount of things we agree on in order even to be able to disagree about some things, right? So again, you get this idea that there is a bedrock of conventions, of things that we agree upon. And this brings up to one of my favorite thinkers, Garfinkel, right? And he did these breaching experiments, which are today you could never get away with doing this. You know, your institutional review board would have you fired within seconds for doing this sort of thing. But at the time, you could. And you know, so he asked his students to basically do these experiments of pretending, for example, that they did not understand what their partner was saying, or asking for way too many details to specify things, because he wanted to disrupt the orderliness of social facts, and so in so doing, get to the background expectancies, the common understandings that make social facts intelligible, that allow us to understand what it is to have a conversation, or what it is to ask a question, that sort of thing. When these social conventions were disrupted, what ensued was bewilderment, consternation, confusion, anxiety on the part of the participants. These are all quotes from the participants. And the interaction became senseless and disorganized. Okay? And if that's making you think of eristic discourse, I'm getting somewhere. Now, recently, these accounts of communication in terms of accountability and commitment have come to the fore, and I'm very sympathetic to this approach. And again, if you look at what they're saying, well, Gertz here in 19, the speaker becomes committed to the hearer to act on a propositional comment. So you say something, you have a commitment. The purpose is to coordinate, and communication is coordinated action for coordinated for action coordination, right? In order to be able to coordinate what they're doing. What happens if the speaker tries to deny the commitment and to avoid the accountability? Well, you can do that, and there's strategies for doing this. And of course, Elder isn't talking about humor, but it's fairly easy to make the step. If you remember this idea of avoiding accountability by saying I was joking, right? So being funny allows you to be unaccountable or non-accountable for your statements. It gets better. There's even stuff that, as far as I know, nobody has really talked about, but that emerges when you start looking at heuristic discourse. Okay, so for example, consistency of belief. You're not supposed to change your mind overnight. Okay, that is, you're supposed to believe the same things day after day. Now, obviously, if somebody proves to you that you were wrong, you change your beliefs, of course. And over long spans of time, yeah, it's acceptable to change your mind. I liked music when I was a teenager that I don't particularly care for anymore. It's reasonable. But if I tell you today that I like strawberries, and tomorrow I say I hate strawberries, you'd be surprised, right? That's not the way it works. Okay, so here's an example from Berlusconi, which, if you don't know who he is, you're a lucky person, but he was an important politician in Italy for over 20 years. On October 22nd in 2008, he said, students had occupied a few schools. He said, I will summon the Minister of the Interior, and I will give him detailed instructions to intervene through the police to make sure that these sit-ins in the schools are stopped. Needless to say, there was a huge reaction from pretty much everybody against this. So the next day, he said, I never said that I should that we should send the police in the schools. Literally the next day. Okay? Now, this is very difficult to counter, because you have to say, are you insane? That's the only way that you could treat this, if you treated it as a serious statement. Of course, you know that he doesn't mean it. And interestingly enough, you don't necessarily think he meant it the first day either. Okay, these are purely performative things that politicians say. So, summing up, here's a graph which should be painful to watch for anyone. And I made it even more painful by throwing in a few things like mutual knowledge, common ground, context. And of course, all of these are emergent properties of discourse. And then I put in sadistically reality, because all of this is, of course, mediated through cognition. But reality is out there. Reality is real. There's nothing we can do about reality, but we can think about it. And that's what we do when we talk. Okay? This is just to give people a headache. So let's move on. So the meat, humor may be eristic. Not necessarily, right? Of course, there is humor that is not aggressive. Even Freud admitted this, right? So I'm not going to belabor the point. But mockery and generally aggressive humor is, in fact, eristic. Now, here's an example, and that's the example in my title. On November 16, 2022, Donald Trump announced that he was running again for president, and the New York Post titled, "Florida Man Makes Announcement." Okay, now, this is the cover of the newspaper. Now, first of all, the fact that this is covered on page 26 is already funny in and of itself. It's not a coincidence, okay? I mean, that because, you know, front page news is important. On page 26, you put, you know, somebody's marriage chronicle, right? It's really not, so that's already fun in itself. But then you get several violations of the principle of cooperation, right? So first of all, Florida man versus Donald Trump, right? Obviously, you have more information than a random Florida man, right? That's obviously the information is there. And then makes announcement is a lot more generic than is running for president, right? So this is already completely in violation of the principle of cooperation, but there is a bonus, which is the Florida man expression. Now, this is an expression that is quite common. And there you have an example of the Florida man news. I picked one deliberately that was just funny, not sexual or involving drugs or anything like that. And there is an article about the Florida man stereotype by Paris. It came out on Substack. It's freely available. And the word cloud gives you an idea of what these Florida man news are about. It's always about being arrested by the police, and it involves alligators, sex, being naked, and stealing stuff, and drugs and stuff like that. You know, so obviously the connotations are all very negative and very sort of ridiculing. Now, interestingly enough, and this is the nice little kicker, the Florida man stereotype is used primarily in Florida. And that's what the map here shows. You see, the darker area is where there are most uses of the term Florida man. So this is actually a self-stereotype that Floridians enjoy using. So I was looking forward to collecting data while there, but I guess it will have to wait for another trip. So again, the New York Post is mocking Trump at several layers, right? And what do you do when you're being mocked like that? Well, it's very difficult to respond to mockery like that, because it is literally a put down, right? That is literally the person mocking you is saying, I am superior to you. It's superiority theory of humor. Okay. If you say ha 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 and try to laugh it off, well, you're agreeing with it, right? So whatever they've said about you, you basically agree with, right? That's not good. If you take offense, then you're susceptible to the claim that you have no sense of humor, right? And that's another sort of rhetorical gambit that happens all the time. Okay, somebody says something nasty, say, well, I was joking. Well, that wasn't funny. Oh, you don't have any sense of humor. That's why you didn't find it funny, right? And then mockery is essentially debasing, right? And often is based on things that you have no control over. So, for example, Rod Blagojevich was a politician from Illinois, I seem to remember. He was universally mocked because he did all sorts of bad things, but for his name, because nobody knew how to pronounce his name. Okay? And I may be sensitive to this because no one knows how to pronounce my name, and Maida did a fantastic job of it. But it struck me as interesting that that's what people were making fun of was his name, not his behavior, was his name. Berlusconi, who was short, was also mocked for being short. He was called the dwarf. Okay, and so of course humor can easily punch down. In other words, make fun of the less powerful, or just be flat out racist, sexist, misogynistic, etc. Right? So again, disclaimer: not all humor is eristic. As I said, some humor isn't eristic at all. So, in conclusion, we have two modes of discourse here. On the one hand, we have eristic discourse, which is aggressive, non-cooperative, and impolite, non-charitable, and it violates all the background expectations and common understandings that we take granted in communication that allow communication to function. It violates, of course, all commitments that we assume, again, for proper communication. So, in other words, and this is my final contention, eristic discourse pretends to be regular, cooperative, or coordinated discourse. People have used different definitions, so I'm being very generic here. But in fact, it isn't. It is a pretense. And it is, in fact, a social lie. Okay, that is, by pretending to be something that it isn't, it puts one over the person communicating, right? So in other words, by pretending to be cooperating, by pretending to be having a regular conversation, a regular debate, and whatever, but in fact, the only thing that the person is doing is trying to win and trying to humiliate the other person. Okay, well, that's it. I have a long list of references you can see, so if anybody wants them, email me. I have my email there. I'll be happy to send you the PowerPoint. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sal. That was incredible. I think we can take questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions.
Gladly. Anne.
Yeah, that was really great talk. Thank you so much. So I don't know where I read this. It was when I was teaching a class on politeness and impoliteness. And it was the author of this paper had reported that they gave their students an assignment to go back on Thanksgiving weekend to their homes and to act super polite to their family. Yeah, say thank you and do all the things that you would do to basically to strangers. And the same thing happened that happened in the Garfinkel thing. I mean, just total chaos in the family.
Yes.
And parents would get furious at the child.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. If you can get me that reference, I would really appreciate it.
Other questions? You can raise your hand or unmute yourself.
I'll go ahead and ask a question. Thank you very much, Sal. That was amazing and such a timely, thoughtful presentation that makes us think, I think, about all kinds of different arenas of public discourse. appreciated that you said that it's really difficult to respond back in a way that kind of restores, yeah, how do you do that, right? So kind of, I like that you detailed, okay, if you respond this way, you're viewed in this manner. If you respond in the other way, you're viewed as humorless, etc. So what, like, as the expert on humor here, what would be the appropriate or the most effective response in these situations?
Well, so unfortunately, I don't have good news. The only correct response to an eristic argument is to walk away. The other option is to punch the person in the face, but that's frowned upon socially. So because there's nothing you can do against an eristic opponent, you only have two options. One is to walk away, and the other one is to become yourself an eristic opponent. And that's, for example, what Harris did during the debate. She mocked relentlessly Donald Trump and baited him until he just self-destructed, you know. But it was a very eristic attitude. You know, she didn't, you know, ask real questions or whatever. She just basically baited him, right? And I mean, that's fine. I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, you know. Morally fighting fire with fire is perfectly acceptable. But you are resorting to eristic discourse. And that's why stand-up comedians, late night comedy, became the locus of political discourse in the teens, and currently still is, because you mock the politicians, and that allows you a modicum of control, because otherwise, what can you do? You know, like, you cannot counter when people are not interested in having a real discussion, a real conversation. There's not anything that you can do about it. You cannot force somebody to cooperate with you.
And Mandy?
Hi, thanks. This is all very new to me. I had a question, but actually I wondered if I could make a comment on the answer that you just gave to Camilla, because I found myself wondering, so certainly you can't force somebody to cooperate with you. But there is also the strategy of naming what they are doing.
If they let you talk long enough to name it, yeah.
Right. And there's only a point in doing that, clearly, if there is, you know, an overhearer, if somebody else is listening, because you're never going to make any progress with the person who is not the non-cooperative person. But it does seem like a possible strategy in
Yes,
public debate situations.
Yes, you know, you're absolutely correct. The problem with that strategy is that it's not usually one statement. In fact, there is a technical term for this. It's called a Gish Gallop, where the person, the eristic interlocutor, produces a string of fallacies and falsities, etc., and they keep adding to it, so that because it's much harder to refute a falsehood than to state one, it takes you much longer, and you run out of time, and you literally cannot address all the falsities and the fallacies that the person has thrown at you. And that's where the term Gish Gallop comes from, because it was a strategy that a politician did. In fact, some people argued that Biden lost the first debate because he was subjected exactly to this. You know, so yes, you know, in an academic conference, it would work. Okay, so if right now you said, well, but you've been eristic because blah blah, you would probably win, because, well, we have an audience of academics, and we, you know, if you said your argument is fallacious, you know, we would listen. But it wouldn't go very far in a debate, you know, on television or God help us in real life.
So may I ask my question?
Absolutely.
It's perhaps not exactly a question, but you brought up the just kidding option. So you tell a joke, you tell it once, you can be treated as having no intention behind it other than the telling of the joke. But the other way this just kidding strategy comes up is where you say something, and you know, we all know like who is the master of this, but you say something apparently seriously, and then you say just kidding.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a strategy that at least some people, so I mean it's very hard to understand how it works to me, because on the one hand, nobody believes the just kidding claim, but it still seems to have this effect of you know, relieving the speaker of responsibility, and it seems to be something that they can do over and over again.
Yes,
So can you speak to that?
Absolutely, and in fact, it's a very, very interesting point. I didn't have time to talk about this, but one of the aspects of eristic discourse is that it's not interested in changing the mind of the interlocutor. And I'll give you an example. I was having a conversation with a young man a few weeks ago who at some point informed me, that 90% of the population of Paris, France, is immigrants. To which I said, that's impossible. That's a ridiculous claim, right? He said, no, I know that. I looked it up. I said, that cannot be, okay? Needless to say, I checked. It's not true. It's 15%, okay? But I'm sure that he felt satisfied that he'd shut me up, okay? Of course, he knew that I was going to look it up, right? But that wasn't the point, because his point was not to try to convince me. His point was to win the argument, okay? So I understand, I'm there with you, because to me it's mysterious, because why would you want to do that? What satisfaction can you get of knowing that for a brief moment I did not destroy you, but then I went home, looked it up, and now next time that I see you, I'm going to tell you, by the way, remember when you said that the population of Paris was 90% immigrants? You're completely wrong, right? But apparently that's satisfying, you know, and I think that this is very common in online discourse, and I'm talking not all online discourse, but I'm talking like 4chan, for example, where you never know who the person you're talking to is. You know, people can change their nickname anytime, so you win it. That's it. It's in perpetuity. It doesn't stick with you. You know, so I think that it's part of this that makes it so incomprehensible for people like us, because we dedicated our lives to convincing people and telling people how things are and teaching people, right? So saying something that someone is going to go and check and say, oh, it's actually wrong, is absurd, right? Because it achieves nothing. Well, it gives you momentary satisfaction of owning the other person.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley had a question.
Yes.
Hi, wonderful talk. So this isn't so much a question, but more a comment on an aspect of what's going on here. So my sense, from my understanding of these people, is that it is less about the person you're talking to right now than your group of like buddies on 4chan that you can go and tell about this encounter. Like it's the humor is about like the solidarity to some extent with these other people, as opposed like whether or not it's actually funny isn't really the point, I guess. I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's definitely it's all about owning the other person. You know, be able to say it's bragging. It's the lulz, right? You know, we did it for the lulz. It's the whole idea of trolling in online discourse. Again, I find that extremely difficult to understand, but you know, I'm not your typical 4chan user, right? So I kind of expect that it's not going to work for me. But yes, I understand that that's the way it is. Thank you. That's very.
Thank you. I have a question about this distinction between cooperative and non-cooperative humor in public. So, you know, we all know sort of cooperative humor in communities, families, and that can work. How easy is it to have cooperative humor? What people say, you can't say anything anymore. You can't make fun of people anymore because punching down is not okay. But I find punching up is just often not very funny. And when it's funny, it's sometimes making fun of people for the wrong reasons, right? So making fun of Donald Trump because of his appearance, I think that's not okay. So yeah, how can you do cooperative humor in public spaces, online debates and such?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you know, I am friends with many stand-up comedians, and they really have a problem because some of them have, for example, stopped performing at colleges because they say that they can't you know, do their act without getting shouted down. Yeah. So what you get is the, you know, comedians like Nate Bargatze. I don't know if you've heard of him. He does. He's quite famous. He was on Saturday Night Live a few months ago, which is kind of like the top. But he does comedy that's completely bland. So like, for example, he has an act that goes on for like 20 minutes about seeing a horse that's sleeping and thinking that the horse is dead, and going to the farmer and saying, your horse is dead. Farmer says, no, the horse is sleeping. You know, so I mean, and it sounds stupid and it's not particularly clever, but it's very funny because you know, he goes on like this for 20 minutes and it's all about minute details, and it's the least offensive comedy in the world. Okay, that is, it's just like, you know, nobody can be offended by people who think that a horse is dead when in fact it was sleeping. Okay, and you know, it's like cats on the internet. You know, and the other thing that you can always rely on is making fun of yourself, because unless it's too extreme, you know, most of the time people will accept that that's a perfectly fine thing to do, at least if you're a man. If you're a woman, that's debatable, you know, but men are allowed to make fun of themselves with impunity. So no, you're absolutely correct. It's often difficult to find in a public context a you know, set of humor that is acceptable. And to tell you the absolute unadorned truth, I had my wife go over my slides and take out all the jokes before I presented, because she was like, no, don't say that. I was like, that was my favorite joke. No. You know, so yeah, you got to be careful. But if you manage to find the right topic, you punch up the right person at the right time, it works beautifully and it's so satisfying. So sometimes taking a little risk is worth it.
So the dead horse thing reminds me about the dead parrot in Monty Python.
Yeah.
Is Monty
One of my favorite skits, yes.
Do we have any last chance for questions?
Or you can email me questions. Absolutely, I'll be happy to answer.
Well, thank you again, Sal, for the inspiring presentation, and everybody for being here and for the questions. We'll see each other tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Good night. Bye, everyone.
Bye.